What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I am creating a strategic advisory board, MVP edition, how it is that I'm thinking about setting up this strategic advisory board, what it's for, and how it's going to help build Killer Chaos OS into the future. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I am actively implementing in terms of mental models, and how we're scaling those mental models into the future. Also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, just to come in and be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure while we're doing it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively striving to solve, which is chaos, and to ultimately just network with cool people doing cool things at the same time. So why this move? Why build a strategic advisory board? And this is one of the things that I am actively thinking about implementing. I have tried it out before and it has worked. I've gotten a couple responses and a couple blanks, and also just a couple people that thought I was pitching. No harm to them, because I completely get it. If someone's asking just for advice to say, hey, I'm building XYZ product and I just need to understand what it is that you're actively doing in terms of your workflow so that we can constantly refine it. I don't know, sometimes it comes off a bit salesy, but that was never the point. But anyways, why this move? So at a high level, it's cool to think about scaling, branding, and millions in revenue, which ultimately it is to think about that, to say, hey, it's cool to, think in terms of scaling, branding, and making millions in revenue. But underneath, it's something more fundamental to ultimately say, hey, there's a deeper layer to that. And we ultimately just need to make sure that we're understanding what the deep layer to that is, and saying, hey, you need accurate data points in order to understand from the exact people that you're building for. So the ultimate goal, or your ICP that you have for the people that you're actually building this product for, you need to ultimately get data points from them. And how are you going to be able to do that? And I see this strategic advisory board as the way for us to scale what it is that we're doing, and also gather those data points that are ultimately just going to allow us to scale what it is that we're doing inside Killer Chaos OS, and also into the future with other builds. And saying, hey, no assumptions, no guesswork. Well, that is the ultimate goal, to say, hey, we don't want to make sure that we're building this off of guesswork, but we want to make sure that we're also not building it off of assumptions, that we're actively just using those data points that we have, and we're building through that, and saying, hey, I'm systemizing, so this is why I'm systemizing these conversations with intentionality and also at scale, to say, hey, each and every single conversation that we do have is a data point, and from that data point we can ultimately refine what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS. So this is where the chaos feedback cycle also comes into play. If you guys know that video earlier on, I made a video all discussing about that, and also saying, hey, we're actively just moving with intentionality, and also just building for scale as well into the future by solving what is ultimately stopping businesses from scaling, which is kind of going deep into inversion thinking, but that's a whole nother topic for a different day. So saying, hey, this is the tactical playbook that we're actively using to build this chaos council, which is basically a group of people that ultimately are there to then enable us to refine what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS. So this is just people that we're reaching out to and saying, hey, this is how I'm actively structuring it in terms of the people. I'm saying, hey, we're not chasing influencers, we're not chasing randoms, we're being strategic about it. We're curating 7 to 12 operators, shop operators that represent our minimal viable segment, which basically is, you can think of it as saying, hey, these are the people within our ICP that we're specifically solving problems for, and they're within our minimal viable segment, and we're only just going to focus on them because they have the most knowledge in the space. And how do we understand what their pain points are? We ultimately just need to have those conversations, and I think those conversations are going to be super key to how we refine what it is that we're building in terms of Killer Chaos OS, and also also what we're going to be doing into the future to say, hey, these are the power users. So saying, hey, we need founders, CEOs, planners. We need to ultimately understand what their pain points are, what they're currently suffering from on a day-to-day basis, because from then we can just take all that data and then we can plug it into the chaos feedback cycle, and then we can ultimately just understand that, hey, we need to make sure that we are building right and we're categorizing this in the right manner that ultimately allows us to then solve their problem, and also just gather those data points that ultimately just allow us to build our minimal viable product, which is different from our minimal viable segment. So ultimately saying, hey, we're building our MVP for our minimal viable segment, and saying, hey, the people who can smell fluff from a mile away, ultimately saying, hey, the people that we're ultimately targeting are the highest C-suite level within the business. They ultimately make the decisions. They're the key decision makers, and we ultimately just need to understand how they're thinking about the future and also what they're actively doing in terms of their internal systems, and also just understand that, hey, what are the things that they face on a day-to-day basis? Are they problem aware of the chaos that they're facing, which is a good thing, and saying, hey, okay, cool, they're facing this chaos. Okay, what is the theme around all these different industries of people that we're speaking to? We'll ultimately then say, hey, we're going to categorize this, and we're ultimately going to use it to refine our product, to making sure that we're actively building Killer Chaos OS in the best possible way, so that it's ultimately just hitting and creating as much ROI as it possibly can, and saying, hey, in as much as it's cool to focus on the people, we also need to focus on the format by saying, hey, how are we actually going to structure these out? How are these, strategic advisory boards going to be working? How are we actively just going to, run this feedback loop? How are we actively going to create it? And then we say, hey, the format would be monthly touch points, asynchronous conversations, and also feedback loops, which is super important to say, hey, each and every single week or each and every month, we just sit down with one of our advisories, have one-on-one conversations, and just ask them like, hey, what are the things that you noticed within this week that ultimately allowed your business to get to the point that it is, and what have you been struggling with in terms of operations and also the back end stuff? What is actually going on within the business that will ultimately just allow us to shape and stay ahead of trends as well in terms of what is going on in terms of operations? Because as companies grow and scale, there are ultimately new problems that do come to effect. So we just want to make sure that we're staying on top of the game by creating this strategic advisory board that we also are constantly creating value for as well. So it's not just a take, but we're ultimately just giving them the platform as well to share what is going on, but also giving value. Because I think the number one thing, or the way I'd like to approach this, is make it value based, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're providing as much value as we possibly can for them, so that they can just just speak to us, and later on down the line that could lead to even future collaborations in terms of building cool stuff together, which will ultimately just allow us to scale what it is that we're doing inside Killer Chaos OS, and also for them on their side, and saying, hey, every interaction fuels a refinement in terms of Killer Chaos OS, saying, hey, we need to just constantly hit the nail in the wall and just constantly refine our machine, refine the way we're thinking about things, the way that we're solving problems as well, and saying, hey, from UX to workflows to features to logic, ultimately saying from each and every single component of Killer Chaos OS, we need to make sure that we're speaking to people within our minimal viable segment, and also just understanding that, hey, we can speak to people in design, learn as much as we possibly can about design, how they're designing their systems, how they're designing their workflows, and also just the features that they're rolling out, and ultimately just understand what it is that they're actively implementing and the way that they're thinking about their business, not only now but into the future, which will ultimately just allow us to scale what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS. Because in as much as it's cool to think about things, I think it's also super important to be actively doing and building each and every single day. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to know what exactly needs to be built? I think through having these conversations and these strategic advisory boards, we're ultimately then just going to have, the level of clarity that allows us to build right, and also have the most accurate knowledge that we possibly can at the time, that is also guided by data. Data is the number one thing, and those data data points from conversations and those feedback loops are going to be super invaluable. And I know that once we fully just, deck this out, it's going to be super, super valuable for us into the future. But in as much as it's valuable, we also just need to make sure that we have one thing on lock, which is KPIs, which KPIs are super, super important. I think in every single thing that you do, you need to be able to measure what it is that you're doing and also measure the level of impact that it is having within your operations and what it is that you're building. So basically, in terms of KPIs, just a general consensus of KPIs that I would basically set for this is basically saying, hey, number one needs to be the number of quantitative insights gathered per week, saying, hey, how many insights are we gathering per week? And just make, just a simple document to say, hey, we just need to make sure that we're having these quantitative insights and how they're guiding what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS. Because one feature that we may think is important, say we ask or we have a sample size of 50 people, and then they ultimately say, hey, this feature is not it's not really necessary, then we can say, hey, we don't actively have to build this feature simply because our file sample size says, no one said that they need that feature, but ultimately just using data-backed insights, I know, is ultimately just going to allow us to scale what it is that we're doing in terms of Killer Chaos OS. But we just need to have a builder's mindset first in order to just build and just fail and just try different things, which is super important. And saying, hey, percentage of ideas implemented based on console input, saying, hey, what is the percentage of the ideas that we're going to be implementing? So just a ballpark figure, we can say 30%, to say, hey, 30% of the ideas that we're getting from our advisory console, we're actively implementing that. And how is it reacting to the market? Is it having the product market fit that we were hoping for? And how can we actively tweak that in order to scale into the future in terms of what it is that we're building in terms of Killer Chaos OS? And the percentage is also just gonna probably increase the more we just test out and refine and hear from people. It could be super low as well. We just ultimately just need to build it out, deck it out, and ultimately just try it out and then see, hey, this is how I'm actively thinking about it in the moment. And also ultimately just having that feedback loop is also going to guide our insights. And also just decision making structures, I think, are going to be super important in terms of, hey, we need to make sure that we have XYZ in terms of how we're going to implement it and which ideas get passed through and which don't, and then ultimately just reach a consensus and say, hey, this is good enough to get passed through to the next level or not, and then say, hey, this is how we're actively building. I just want to be strategic as possible, and also just think things through, which is super important, but not think things through too much, because that ultimately just then leads to procrastination. But we just need to have a builder's mindset first, like I'm been saying this video. So just build, and then just fix everything as we go. And saying, hey, response velocity to advisor feedback. So hey, how quickly are we getting things done? How quickly are we getting these responses based on their feedback? How quickly are we rolling them out? Just tracking that is also going to be super important. Also saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're tracking two things, which are going to be one of the top line and the bottom line, which are going to be your lagging indicator and your leading indicator. So the leading indicator is going to be basically the sentiment around scoring each sentiment score around each Chaos OS feature prototype, ultimately saying, hey, what is the score that we're going to be having in terms of each Chaos OS feature? How are we going to be scoring that? Is it going to be on a 1 to 10 basis, or is it just going to be a percentage wise? And ultimately just understanding that, hey, this is a leading indicator as to this is working or this is not. And then ultimately with that, we need to make sure that we're tying it with the lagging indicator, of which is the number of feature partnerships and co-builds generated, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're leading with this, and then we have this just right behind, which is the lagging indicator, which is the number of partnerships and also just the number of co-builds that we have generated alongside with it. And then ultimately just run this up and say, hey, this is our lagging indicator and this is our leading indicator, and this is how we're actively just thinking these through, and we're tracking the numbers in the way that we say, hey, in 5-10 years from now, we ultimately understand that, hey, this is how we were in this specific phase in time, so now we're in a completely different space. But this ultimately is ultimately based on strategic intelligence gathering, ultimately just gathering as much insights as we possibly can, which ultimately enable Chaos OS to be the best possible feature that we can possibly make it, and just keep pushing the boundary forward of what we think is impossible today and make it a new realm of possibility tomorrow, which is super important, because I like to say iteration is the key to innovation, and this is how we ultimately just gonna be able to innovate and also make it timeless, so that we just constantly just pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible today, and just just like I said, create a new realm of possibility tomorrow. And why this is bigger than feedback, ultimately I believe this is bigger than feedback. It's two separate components, but this I would say is bigger than feedback. It's saying, hey, I'm not doing this to sell. And just a disclaimer, I'm not mainly doing this just to sell. That is the the least thing that I'm rolling this out for. I'm doing it to build a edge of relevance. Ultimately saying, hey, I want to actively just build an edge of relevance that we know what it is that's going on in terms of trends. We know how to stay on top of that, and we're just constantly refining the machine of what is of which Killer Chaos OS is going to be about. And with the right minds at the table, one of the most important things is that we're actively just having the right set of people that are helping us guide this strategic board, the strategic advisory board, and saying, hey, we have the best of the best within our camp, and we're ultimately building features and rolling out ROI based services, and based on that we're actively just building in that sense and saying, hey, what I see this console creating, which is one of the most important things into the future, is that I see it creating or helping us develop heat maps, like clarity on what matters, basically allowing us to understand, hey, these are the certain types of things that are needed within operations, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're creating sales systems that are generating cash flow for them. We need to understand where the most touch points are as well, making sure that we just have those heat maps to say, hey, this is where the most heat is in terms of what it is that we're building, and also just making sure that we get that level of clarity through that, because once we understand that, hey, these are one of the most used features in terms of Killer Chaos OS, then we understand that, hey, we need to make sure we're building more of this and zone in more on this and zoom in a lot more, and just constantly just refine the machine, and also helping us open serendipitous loops for the future collabs, serendipitous loops for future collabs, which is going to be super valuable into the future, and ultimately say, hey, these collaborations are going to be based off of what it is that we're doing today, and ultimately how we're going to scale that into the future, and saying, hey, it's also going to help us make products smarter with every single conversation that we have, making sure that each and every single conversation is ultimately allowing us to refine Killer Chaos OS, and ultimately allowing us to stay ahead of the curve, and also just allowing us to just build better products and scale our mental models into the future, so that we can ultimately just create as much value as we possibly can, and get closer to the grand vision of inspiring millions of people, and also reshaping industries, which I know that into the future we're going to get to. We just need to make these small steps and then create that momentum that ultimately gets us to where we need to get to, and saying, hey, this needs to be timeless, it needs to be high leverage, and it's ultimately shaping the future of Chaos OS with signal, not noise. Ultimately saying that we're focusing on signal, we're focusing on creating leverage, and we're ultimately just building Killer Chaos OS into this massive beast that ultimately creates as much value as it possibly can, and that we're using user feedback, and also just having this advisory board at the forefront of what it is that we're going to be doing in terms of rolling out features, and also just understanding what headache causing things are happening in terms of the biggest companies in terms of the biggest companies, and ultimately just build around that. But this is ultimately going to be powered through this strategic advisory board, which we're actively just going to build out. I'm super confident that this is going to be one of the most important things that we're going to have in terms of our internal strategic advisory board, and into the future I will make a couple update videos, possibly just going through on how it's going following what is happening and how we're actively tracking this. But this is probably one of the most important things that I see us using into the future, of just having this, strategic advisory board of people that we're going to reach out to, that are ultimately just going to allow us to get that feedback loop and that level of clarity that ultimately allows us to build Chaos OS into this massive beast that reshapes industries and inspires billions of people and has insane or $100 million worth of impact into the future. But in order to get there, we just need to build the momentum that gets there. And what better way to do it than to do these videos each and every single day, gain a new level of clarity, still in the trenches, try new things, and ultimately just scale. We're going to fail so many times, and that's okay. Ready for that, and we just actively have to build the future, because the future starts now. So I'm super excited. This is day 52. I think we have 48 more to go, so I'm super excited. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, comments, make sure to comment down on this YouTube video, or just connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.